Chapter 4 of The Adventures of a Nature Guide by Enos Mills. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness defend you from seasons such as these? Shakespeare. Chapter 4 Trees at Timberline. All day I followed the dwarfed, battered uppermost edge of the forest through the heights of the Rockies. My barometer steadily said that we were 2 miles higher than the sea. From a stand of dead timber I cut 11 small trees and carried them in one load to my campfire. They were so gnarled and ancient-looking that they aroused my curiosity, and with a magnifier I counted the annual rings in each. The youngest was 146 years of age, and the oldest 258. The total age of these 11 trees was 2,191 years. These and other trees had blazed in my fire and fallen to ashes long before I fell to sleep beneath the low and crowded stars. With rare exceptions, the trees at timberline are undersized and of imperfect form. A forest only 8 feet high is not uncommon. One winter a tough staff that I used was almost an entire tree, which had been nearly 400 years in growing. A tree that I carried home in my pocket the microscope showed to be more than 70 years old. Annual rings in many of these timberline trees are scarcely 1/100th of an inch in diameter, while a fate-favored cottonwood or eucalyptus may in one season envelop itself with a ring that is more than an inch in diameter. The age of a timberline tree cannot be approximated by its size or appearance, or by the size or the age of its neighbors. It may have lived twice as long, and it may have endured more hardships than its nearby fellows of similar size and appearance. Environment has shaped many timberline trees into huge and crooked vines. Still others are picturesque, bell-shaped individuals, formed by the deeply drifting snows pressing the limbs downward and against the trunk. During the summer months the limbs partly regain their natural position, and the result is a slender bell shape in tall trees and a heavy bell outline in stocky ones. Instead of a symmetrical limb development, many trees are one-sided. Imagine a tree with storm-threshed limbs all flung out on one side of the trunk like a tattered, wind-blown banner. Then imagine thousands of bannered trees scattered and grouped in a mountainside forest front. The climatic conditions at the forest frontier are trying, but timberline trees are hardy and probably have as long or even longer lives than the majority of their more fortunately placed relatives. The oldest timberline settler that I ever studied had been permanently located at an altitude of 11,437 feet for 1,182 years when finally killed by fire. Much branched and stocky, its height was 12 feet and its diameter a foot above the earth was 4 feet 6 inches. What these timberline trees lack in symmetry and heroic size, they make up in hardiness and aggressiveness. Timberland in the far Northland marks the latitudinal limits, while the mountain timberline shows the altitudinal limits of the forest life zone. The forest furthest north ends in a ragged, battered edge against the Arctic prairies. The polar storms that sweep across the broken ice fields and barren lands meet with first resistance in the advanced, low crouching timberline of sturdy spruces. Timberline far up the sides of high mountains is as strange and as abrupt a boundary as the crooked and irregular shoreline of the sea. This mountainside timberline is the forest's uppermost edge. Above are the treeless distances and barren heights of the Arctic alpine zone. Below and away from the ragged edge drapes and rolls the dark and broken robe of forest. Like old ocean's shifting and disputed boundary line, timberline is a place where contending forces ever surge and roar. Nowhere does this forest frontier, the ever contending line of battle between woods and weather, appear more stormy or striking than in the high mountains of the West. For miles this timberline extends away in a front of dwarfed and distorted trees, millions of them, ever fiercely fighting a relentless enemy. The veterans show the intense severity of the struggle as they stand resolutely in their inhospitable heights. Timberline trees are among the distinct attractions of our national parks. Timberline is probably the most telling in the Rocky Mountain National Park, but in the Yosemite, Mount Rainier, and Glacier National Parks it has striking phases. It is an illustrated and graphic story, one of the most powerful in the book of nature. In Colorado, this mountainside tree line is 2 vertical miles above the shoreline of the sea. Like the ocean's edge, timberline has miles that are straight and level as a die, but in places it sweeps outward around a peninsula and follows the crooked line of an invading canyon. There are forested bays, beautiful coves, and wooded islands. Stretches of forest climb high ridges, and invading outposts make a successful stand in favorable spots among the snowfields far above the main forest front. Violent, dry winds that blow ever from the same quarter are a powerful, relentless foe of many a forest frontier. They either point all limbs toward the leeward or prevent all limbs except leeward ones from growing. Trees are pushed out of plumb and entire forests are pushed partly over. Then, overweighted with snow, they are forced down to earth and flattened out. The wind and snow never allow them to rise again, and they become in effect huge vines, or low, long-bodied prehistoric animals headed to the leeward. They refuse to die, and many live on for centuries. Snow, cold, and dryness are the chief factors which determine whether the forest may or shall not grow. In some localities, the snow line is the barrier that forms the timberline. Dryness of locality combined with dry winds resists forestation. But the sand blasts of dry, windy localities play havoc by beating and flailing the trees. This sand beats off the bark on the trees' stormward quarter, exposing their very bones. Often it eats its way into the already half-flayed trunks. The stormward half of many trees is dead and lifeless, a sand-graven totem pole, while the living half holds long, tattered limbs streaming leeward. This gale-blown sand frequently prevents trees from growing higher than the shelter behind which they stand. In places, so-called trees may be seen with trunks 1 to 3 feet in diameter and only 1 or 2 feet high, cut off by the sand fire of the high winds. Numerous long limbs reach out from the trunk in all directions. The shoots which these limbs send up are clipped off by the wind-shot sand. In time this treetop is a table or brush of bristles 20 feet across and trimmed off as level as a lawn. Hundreds of these trees are often crowded together until the identity of each is lost, forming acres of clipped, low tree lawn. The wide-spreading mass is too low to crawl under and not quite strong enough to allow one to walk on the surface. It is a good mattress to sleep on. Often I have rolled out of one of these treetop beds without discovering the tumble till morning. Snowslides, landslides, and other factors often pile up embankments of debris, and these form large windbreaks whose shelter allows trees to grow in places formerly windswept and inhospitable. Trees at timberline are eternally vigilant and promptly seize every new opportunity or opening. One spring a landslide on the slope of Mount Clarence King piled a shipload of stones on a windswept, treeless flat. A few years later, several dozen spruce were growing up in the leeward of this chance-made shelter. But slides or other forces occasionally remove shelters behind which a forest front was formed, or they place an obstruction which changes the course of the prevailing winds. Snowslides occasionally cut an avenue down into a forest, which exposes the trees on the edges of the new avenue. Or an old stretch of forest front is sheared off by a slide. With the hardened front ranks removed, the less hardy trees thus exposed are slashed and shot to pieces by the cutting edges of the prevailing gales. One day I came out upon a long, hedge-like growth of trees extending down the slope. Here the high sand-flinging winds blew from the west to the east. A lone boulder, about 6 feet in diameter, at the west end of the hedge had sheltered the first tree that had grown up to the leeward of it. Then another tree had risen in the shelter of this one, and still others in order and in line eastward until the long hedge was grown. The straight line of the hedge from west to east showed that the high winds were always from the same quarter, and the topography of the place had compelled them to rush along the straight line which they had followed. The front of this hedge was the diameter of the boulder, and the further end, about 200 feet away, was about a foot higher. Each summer thousands of shoots and twigs grew out on the top and sides, but each succeeding winter the winds trimmed them off. Long afterward, in pursuit of a woodchuck one day, a grizzly dug out a few tons of earth and stones by the side of this boulder. Frost and water undermined, until gravity caused the boulder to roll over. The hedgerow was quickly sandblasted to pieces, and in a few years all that remained was a number of stubby trunks, half round, with the flattened stormward side fantastically ground and engraved by the wind and sand. I have followed the timberline for hundreds of miles in the Sierras, the Cascades, and the Rocky Mountains. One evening I camped on the rim of Wild Basin in what is now the Rocky Mountain National Park. Out of the opposite side of the basin, Long's Peak swept ruggedly far up into the sky. I was on the eastern slope of the Continental Divide. Great light bars, miles in length, and long shadow pennants of peaks lay across the basin. As the sun descended, these lengthened and pushed down the descending slopes. Finally they reached out upon the great plains nearly 100 miles distant. Nearby a solitaire sang with inspiring and unrivaled eloquence. He sang from a crag and from a treetop, and then with intense ecstasy, while darting and dropping, wheeling and gliding, he gladdened the air above his nesting mate. Once he rose high above the shadows and for a moment poured forth his song in the bright sunlight above. As he ceased, the beavers began making merry in a pond just below. I watched them and the purple ripples they made. Presently the ripples faded from sight, but in the darkness the easy movements and dividing wavelets of the swimmers were revealed by the rocking of the reflected stars. In the night a white-crowned sparrow repeatedly sang briefly. A camp bird quietly waited for my awakening. Later a tiny chipmunk bashfully called. An astonished squirrel first stared in silence, then with a jerky note scolded and bluffed from a safety-first distance, but at last gave way to curiosity and came closer. Big game is common along the boundary of woodland and grassland. Deer and elk frequent timberline during the summer, and mountain sheep may be seen at any time. In the autumn it is frequented by bears. The mountain lion, coyote, and fox come to this edge of the woods to watch and wait, and here concealed gaze out upon the upland open. Beautiful lakes, gouged by glaciers out of solid rock, are scattered along the furthest edge of the forest. They are one of the distinctive charms of these Arctic gardens. With a border of wild cliff, a waterfall, a fringe of brilliant flowers, grassy spaces, picturesque trees in clusters and singly, these lakes are wildly, poetically lovely. On the whole, the heights are becoming drier. Many summits are no longer tolerant to the trees. Parts of the Rocky Mountains are in the arid belt, and their winters are often extremely dry. Dry, high winds frequently sweep their summits, sucking moisture from all vegetation. The unprotected trees in the forest front of dry ridges suffer greatly, thousands perishing during a single dry winter. I walked for hours along a dry summit slope strewn with the bleaching bones of millions of veteran pines and spruces. Here over a long front the battle had gone against the forest. The nearest frontier was half a mile down the slope. Timberline is not fixed. In places it is creeping forward and upward. In other reaches it is being driven back. Still other boundary lines, like those of nations, are stationary for years. Then suddenly these are obliterated and redrawn as territory is lost or won. Only a few of the earth's numerous tree people dwell at timberline. Those most commonly found both at timberline in the heights and low levels of the north are pine, spruce, fir, aspen, birch, and willow. On the eastern slope of Long's Peak, timberline is approximately 2 miles above sea level. Here, in a moist place by a tiny tributary of the Mississippi, grow Engelmann spruce, alpine fir, black birch, aspen, and Arctic willow. On a nearby dry slope, all the trees are limber pines. On Mount Orizaba, close to the equator, timberline is maintained above the altitude of 13,000 feet. In the Rockies of Colorado and in the Sierras, it is at approximately 11,500 feet. The highest timberline of normal trees in the United States that I have found is on a gulch of the San Juan Mountains at an altitude of 12,300 feet. Here are upright trees more than a foot in diameter and 60 feet high. Timberline in Switzerland is about 6,500 feet. On Mount Washington, about 5,000. On Mount Rainier, about 7,000. In most localities it is higher on the southerly mountain slopes than on the northerly. In the far north The altitudinal and latitudinal timberlines converge and form the defensive outpost of the forest on the edge of the polar world. Broken wildflower gardens crowd and color every ragged opening among the picturesque tree groups on the forest frontier. Many of these flowers are dwarfed and tiny, but in moist places they grow thickly and tall. Among the last trees I have seen wild sheep wading shoulder deep through wide meadows of colored bloom. A typical timberline garden is a ragged edged acre fenced off and sheltered by a weird low wall of trees. Here and there a blooming open way connects it with an adjoining garden. A young tree clump and a boulder pile add artistic touches. Here and there appear low-growing, many-tinted phlox, tall, stately columbines with silver and blue ribbons at the top, blue mertensia, taller still, paintbrushes touched with a variety of shades, anemones, gentians, white monk's hood, and bending upon its stem a ray-faced golden-brown galliardia. One winter the snow drifted deeply over a stretch of forest as large as a huge circus tent. The following summer it partly melted. The next winter new snow was added, and the following spring the drift was larger than before. It did not melt away until the third summer. In the meantime the several hundred spruce trees were kept asleep in a natural cold storage and had failed to grow. This is why their annual rings were 2 less in number than those of the neighboring trees of the same age. Trees have tongues. They record in their annual rings the larger experiences of the years, the triumphs of friendly seasons, and the batterings and the burns that fall to the lot of those in the front ranks of high mountain forests. A timberline veteran might tell of the wealth of moonlight on a winter night, with forest outposts half buried in the white snow, of crowded stars in the field of space, of terrific winds and irresistible avalanches of vast snow piles. With flying snow, in perfect autumn days and during mist-filled nights, I have slept and communed with my campfire at timberline. Timberline gives one the feeling of being on the edge of things. Envelop it in unevenly moving mist, and everything seems a mystery. The strangely shaped trees and the weird forms of tree clumps half revealed are a part of the indefinite, the uncomprehended. Add to this vague realm the magic of a campfire, and one loses the experience of ages and again is a primitive, crouching fire worshipper in a new and unexplored world. A campfire ever recalls the ages long past and paints primeval scenes. Through all the centuries, the campfire has been a place of safety and comfort, of hope and cheer. Though they stand in one place all their years, trees have adventurous lives from their seedling days to battered old age, and stored in their unrolled and untranslated annual rings are their records and perhaps glimpses of the ever-changing scenes in which they grew. Sometimes, while watching my changing campfire blaze, I have half believed that the blazing tree was picturing with fire the story of its life, the larger experiences of the years, the triumphs of the good seasons and the failures of the bad, the battles with wind and frost, with fire and insect foes. Surely no picture ever painted is more suggestive than the campfire. With it, the imagination brings the dead past back to life, and its people in fitting scenes act again the parts they once played. The big trees of California are the greatest living wonders of the world. In the serene Sierras they have achieved the dignity befitting the largest and the oldest living things upon this earth. Compared with these big trees, the timberline trees of the Rockies are pygmies and infants. Yet who shall say that the life story of the timberline tree is the less inspiring? To stand beneath the big trees is to feel the silent eloquence of the noblest of a noble race. To stand above the dwarfed and battered front ranks of the intrepid timberline forests, where the storm king reigns and the eagle soars, is to live with fired imagination through all the long years of battle, and to feel the triumphs of the unconquerable. Timberline touches the heart with a sense of universal kinship. End of chapter 4.